Taylor Hopson, this year.
Alright. Counselor Witness, could you grab the chair and go a little bit closer?
This year?
Yeah.
Is this good?
Maybe a little bit more to the left, please. Like,
My left?
towards you. Smile. Go on, go on, go on. Beautiful. Thank you.
Good morning. Would you please introduce yourself?
My name's Taylor Hopson.
Ms. Hopson, do you know why you're here today? Why is that?
My best friend was killed.
Was your best friend Vanessa Sullivan?
Yes.
How did you two become best friends?
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance.
Why is it relevant?
In a case like this, relevance demands that we show evidence that makes something more or less likely. How Taylor came to know Vanessa, how they came to be best friends, does not show that any fact in this case is more or less likely.
Why do I care how they became friends?
Your Honor, I'm trying to show that they were close friends and were for a long time, and Taylor would know how Vanessa acts.
Is her knowledge of how the victim in this case may or may not have been aged relevant to the outcome?
It could show her in a more credible light. It would place her at the scene. It'd give a background.
Can you go on that shot?
Under Rule 402, this evidence is not admissible.
I had several rules. Go ahead.
Ms. Hobson, how did you and Vanessa become friends?
I moved in next to her when I was 8. We figured out everything we had in common, and from there we were almost inseparable. We had walkie-talkies so we could talk when we couldn't go outside, and we would play princess. And we went to middle school, we decided which boys were cute and who wasn't, and we even picked our prom dresses together, graduated and walked down the aisle together. How could you not be best friends with someone like her?
And did you remain best friends with her until the day of the crash?
Yes.
Now, Ms. Hobson, I know this is going to be hard. I'm going to have to ask you a few questions about the night of the crash. If you need a moment, just let me know. What happened that night? What was the first thing? How did those night begin?
Well, she came to get me around 6:45. We went to Chubby's, a bar, to see this band Chatterbox from our school. They were performing, and so we went to Chubby's and got there around 7.
Were you and Vanessa going to drink that night?
Yes.
How were you all going to get home?
She was bringing a friend down with her, and she said that he'd be the designated driver.
Now, you got to the bar. What happened once you got there?
As soon as we came in, I saw Danny, her friend, and so I went up to him and I asked him if he would be the designated driver.
What did he tell you?
He told me to lighten up, said anybody can have 1 or 2 drinks and still be fine to drive, and that he probably wouldn't be drinking anymore.
Did he drink anymore?
Yes.
After you spoke with Danny, then what did you do?
We moved to find a table so we could watch the band, and almost as soon as we sat down, he ordered straight whiskey, and then he ordered a shot and beer, and he just kept getting drinks.
What happened after you all sat down?
He went to the bar, which made me happy because I hadn't seen Vanessa in so long, and it was nice to talk to her and catch up.
And then after y'all caught up, what happened?
The band was about to perform, and so then we came back.
So the band was about to perform, and y'all were at the table. What happened next?
There was, we sent over whiskeys and ginger ale, and I hate whiskey, and Vanessa doesn't really like it either. And Danny loved it. I didn't drink mine, and Vanessa didn't drink hers, but the drinks weren't very nice for a while.
What happened after y'all had those drinks?
The band performed, they did a great job, and then when we finished the first set, I went to the restroom.
What happened after you came out of the restroom?
When I got out, I saw Danny on stage with their guitar playing it, and I was so shocked and
Objection,
appalled.
Your Honor. More prejudicial than probative. May I be heard?
Please.
Testimony about Danny partying that night and celebrating his friend's birthday, in this case, is more prejudicial than it is probative. To show that Danny was playing on the stage might unfairly prejudice the jury into thinking that he was more intoxicated than he actually was, and should be directed towards Danny Dawson himself rather than a third party. Hearing it from Taylor Hopson is substantially more prejudicial than it is probative.
You have to respond?
Your Honor, in this case, we have to prove that the defendant was drunk. I think his actions at the bar speak very clearly to what kind of level he was actually at. And I think that it's extremely probative to find out how he was acting while at the bar before driving the car.
I'll give you one last shot.
Ms. Hopson can testify to what Danny was saying and the way he was behaving, but testifying to the fact
One of
that
the ways he was behaving, jumping up on stage, taking a band member's guitar and playing it in front of a group of people.
when we examine evidence like that, it unfairly prejudices the jury into thinking that he was more drunk than he actually was. And that's something that should be asked.
Are you admitting that your client was drunk?
No,
Okay.
I'm implying that he wasn't, but that this testimony unfairly prejudices the jury into thinking he was.
It's going to be up to the jury to decide to take the evidence. If the jury believes that he did that while sober, then so be it. If the jury believes that he did that while not sober, then so be it. But it's going to be up to the jury. If there are objections, I'll rule.
Ms. Hopson, can you describe what you saw again?
I said he was on stage with their guitar playing it, and I was so appalled. I mean, who gets on stage and picks up a group's instruments and starts playing? And I mean, he had to be dragged off stage. It was really embarrassing.
How was he acting at this point?
Like he was drunk. He was acting like a complete fool.
What happened after he was dragged off stage, you said?
The band came over. Like I said, we were friends with the lead singer, and we'd already met them before, and so they came over to say happy birthday to us and celebrate.
And what happened after they came over?
They invited me up to sing Vanessa's favorite song, Sunday Morning, for her birthday, and so I went up there with them.
After you sang this song, what happened?
I sang 2 more songs with them because the crowd really liked it.
And were you done after those 3 songs?
Yes.
What happened whenever you were done with those 3 songs?
We decided it was time to leave.
How's the defendant acting right now?
Well, when we walked out, he wasn't acting very well. He was kind of stumbling a little bit, and when he reached over to open the door of the car, his breath reeked of alcohol and still beer and liquor, and I was a little bit worried.
Ms. Hopson, I'm sure the jury wants to know, why did you get in the car with him if he seemed drunk to you?
It was a mistake. If I knew then what I knew now, I would have never. And I didn't realize how bad he was until we started driving. And I was asking him to slow down and stop, but it was too late. And I couldn't get out of the car. It was a mistake.
How was his driving?
It was scary. He was swerving and he was speeding. And I felt like he was going 80 miles per hour, and I was really scared, and Vanessa was really scared as well.
Did either of you say anything?
We kept asking him to slow down and to watch out and to stop swerving and begging him to slow down.
Objection, Your Honor. These statements are hearsay.
I think there are two statements. Let's start with her own statements. Apparently, she said, slow down. Why is that hearsay?
It's an out-of-court statement being offered for the truth of the matter asserted.
What's the truth of the matter? Slow down.
It implies that the driver was driving too fast. The truth is that there was a cause for the request to slow down.
Well,
Your Honor, it was a present sense impression.
so are you admitting it is hearsay, but you think there's an exception?
I do. Ms. Hopson,
Well, let's start with, are you admitting it is hearsay?
yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Then what exception do you think applies?
It was a present sense impression. She was in the car, and she felt that the car was going fast. Too fast, even.
Why is this, or is this not a present sense impression?
This is not a present sense impression because it's a statement that implies that there was some speeding that occurred. It's not something that the witness saw and was using to describe the moment. It was a command that's an out-of-court statement that's being offered for the truth of the matter asserted. So like Mr. Armour said, it's hearsay, but it's not present sense impression, so it's not admissible.
Given your admission that it's hearsay, I'm going to sustain both statements, or sustain your objection as to both statements.
Motion to strike?
Sure. Jury, disregard what you've already heard.
Ms. Hopson, did Vanessa call anybody?
Yes. In order to get Danny, to tell Danny things would be okay, and she said she'd call her dad and let him know we'd be a little bit late. We weren't going to make her curfew.
Objection. The statements regarding what Vanessa said in the car are also hearsay.
To our father, saying I'm going to be late.
Yes, these statements are hearsay.
What's the truth that's being asserted?
The truth that's being asserted is that she called her father to tell him that she was going to be late so Danny would slow down. And that is the truth of the matter asserted, and therefore it's not admissible.
What's the truth of I'm going to be late?
It means that the driver could change the way that he was driving,
If I tell you I'm going to be late, what's the truth in that statement?
that you're not going to be on time.
Do you think that's what they're trying to prove, that she was not going to be on time?
No, Your Honor, I think what they're trying to prove is that the response to these hearsay statements was or was not made.
Are they allowed to admit out-of-court statements not offered with the truth of the matter asserted to show the impact on the listener?
They are. If these statements are going
I'm
to
going
be
to overrule
effective.
the objection to that, yes.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Again, what did Vanessa tell her father?
That she was going to be a little bit late. She has a curfew, and we were already leaving the bar pretty late, and Danny said that he could make it in 8 minutes, and I live right next to her. It's a 20-minute drive, but he said he could do it in 8. He took it as a personal challenge.
Did Vanessa's father answer the phone?
No.
Have you heard the message recording since that night?
Yes.
And you recognize that you heard it right now?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state would like to play the message recording. Objections have been waived and it was taken care of at pre-trial.
Is this stage one?
I believe it is, yes.
Okay.
Your Honor, I'd like to show the transcript.
Please do.
Anyway, just wanted to let you know that we're going to be
Thank you, Ms. Hopson. Absolutely.
Any cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
Please.
Ms. Hopson, I realize that this is difficult for you, and if at any moment you need to take a break, please let me know. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what happened the night of September 24th, 2010. You and your friend Vanessa arrived at the bar at about 7.
Yes.
And that's where you met up with Danny.
Yes.
You didn't know Danny very well.
No.
You'd only met him once before.
Yes.
But you were there to celebrate Vanessa's birthday.
Yes.
When you got to your table, you, Danny, and Vanessa all ordered drinks.
Danny ordered the drink and he wanted to get shots from me and Vanessa, but I don't like shots.
You did start drinking.
Yes, I had drinks.
You weren't really sure how many drinks you had before dinner.
The waiter, he kept filling the drinks so quickly, I switched to tea because I couldn't keep track.
Yeah. So you told us on direct examination that you saw Danny go on stage.
Yes.
You also had the opportunity to do that.
Yes.
In fact, you were allowed to go on stage and perform 3 songs with the band.
Yeah.
And during that time, you didn't have a clear view of Danny and Vanessa.
No.
At one point in the night, you went to the bathroom.
Yes.
And when you were in the bathroom, you didn't have a clear view of Danny and Vanessa.
No.
At another point, you told us that Danny went out to the bar to talk to the bartender, and at that point, you didn't have a clear view of Danny.
No.
At about 12:40 a.m., you, Vanessa, and Danny left the bar together.
Yes.
Vanessa asked Danny to drive.
She already established that he would be driving, so yes, he was going to drive.
So the 3 of you got in the car together,
Yes.
and you started driving towards Canyon Road.
Yes.
And that night, it was really dark.
Yes, it was late at night, so it was dark.
And you noticed that the only light on Canyon Road came from a nearby house.
Yeah, that house had light. Yes.
And that night, it was pouring.
Yes.
In fact, you said that visibility was really bad.
It was.
Thank you, Ms. Hopson. Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Avery, you're up.
No, Your Honor.
May this witness be kindly excused?
We ask that the witness step down.
Anything further from the state?
Yes, Your Honor, the prosecution calls Officer Foster to the stand. Your Honor, may I proceed? Will you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Yes, my name is Officer Ryan Foster.
Officer Foster, why are you here today?
I was both the first responder on the scene of the accident. I also conducted a accident reconstruction to determine why the accident was caused.
First, let's talk about the night of the accident. What were you doing when you found out an accident had occurred?
I was on patrol at Canyon Road at the time that I got the call.
What did you do when you got the call saying there was an accident?
Well, I went straight there. The accident was on the specific curve on Canyon Road.
What did you see when you got to the accident scene?
There was a white Chevrolet Impala that had run off the west side of the roadway. It looked to me at the time that it had hit a tree. The only person that I could see at that time was a young man who was pacing around in the roadway.
Do you see that young man here in court today?
Yes, I do.
Can you point him out for the jury?
Yes, it's the defendant.
So what did you do when you got to the accident?
Well, the first thing that I did was to do what we call controlling the scene. See if anybody needs medical attention, make sure that none of the evidence is getting contaminated, generally just try to restore order.
Did anyone need medical attention?
Yes. There was a young woman in the passenger seat of the car who I later identified to be Vanessa Sullivan, who was not breathing and not responding at all. Of course, I phoned for an ambulance immediately.
After you secured the scene, what did you do next?
I began to interview the defendant.
What happened when you interviewed the defendant?
I wasn't able to discern much at the time. All he told me was that he wished that he had kept better control of the car and that he needed another drink.
The defendant told you that he needed another drink?
Yes.
Did he ever mention anything about a deer in the road?
No, not once the entire time I talked to him.
Did he ever mention why he swerved?
No, he didn't. He mostly just blamed it on himself.
So what did you do when the defendant who was driving the vehicle told you that he needed another drink?
Well, it was near that time that I noticed that he was stumbling and slurring his words. It was at that time that I started to perform what we call field sobriety tests.
What are field sobriety tests?
A field sobriety task, is a task that you give to an individual, and you observe their behavior, and based on what mistakes they make or don't make when performing the task, you can determine roughly their level of intoxication.
What did you determine the defendant's level of intoxication to be?
He failed all 4 field sobriety tests that I administered to him. I determined that it was most likely that he was very intoxicated.
Objection, lack of foundation.
Why?
Officer Foster just told us about some field sobriety tests that he conducted, but he didn't go into any detail about what those tests were, how someone were to pass or to fail them, and therefore to just declare that Danny Dawson was probably intoxicated is misleading to the jury. There's been a lack of foundation.
Your Honor, under Rule 701, all we have to show is that it was rationally based upon Officer Foster's perception. He's the one who administered the tasks. He said he watched whether or not the defendant could complete the tasks, and since he wasn't able to complete the tasks...
How does the state of Midlands define being intoxicated?
Pardon me?
How does the state of Midlands define being intoxicated?
Your Honor, they just say that if a person is under the effect of alcohol, then they are intoxicated. However, we're not talking about it in a legal sense. We're purely talking about it from his observations and what Officer Foster believes intoxication.
The problem is we're in a courtroom. I think we are talking about it in a legal sense, especially since you're trying to throw him in jail for the rest of his life for it. So, given that, does the state of Midlands have a BAC limit that constitutes intoxicated?
Yes, Your Honor. In the statutes here in Midlands, they designate .08 to be the level of intoxication.
And how is his rationally based perceptions able to tell him that the defendant was or was not above that level?
Your Honor, his perceptions aren't able to tell us that. What his perceptions can tell us is whether or not he was intoxicated. What the BAC tells us is to what extent he was intoxicated, which Officer Foster cannot tell us.
Response?
If Officer Foster is going to talk about whether or not Danny Dawson was intoxicated that night, whether or not we get a specific level from this witness, they still need to lay the proper foundation and go into exactly what tests were conducted and how they were conducted before they can make a final conclusion.
Okay. This is one of those areas where I think the jury is going to be the ultimate decider, and I don't want them influenced, by anything that, unless it's coming from an expert or somebody with a heck of a lot of foundation, you haven't gotten there yet. I'm going to sustain the objection for now.
Yes, Your Honor.
Motion to strike that testimony?
The last, I think, 4 words will be stricken.
Officer Foster, why do you use field sobriety tests?
Based on a field sobriety test, we can tell roughly how intoxicated an individual is. We don't use it as a determining factor. We use it as a test to see whether or not we should send them on and actually have their blood alcohol content taken.
Did you get enough facts and data from conducting these tests to make a determination as to the defendant's intoxication?
Yes, I did 4 field sobriety tests. In each of them, I personally observed the defendant's behavior.
What kind of principles and methods do you use when you're conducting a field sobriety test?
We're trained by the department and various other experts as to exactly what to look for. We're not looking for perfect accuracy or perfect speed, but there are very specific mistakes that an individual makes when they may be under the influence of alcohol.
The night of the accident, were you able to use those specific mistakes that you're looking for when you conducted the field sobriety test on the defendant?
Yes, I was.
What did you determine after conducting those tests?
I determined that the defendant was under the influence of alcohol.
Objection, lack of foundation.
Well,
Your Honor, under Rule 702, we have satisfied that he had sufficient facts and data, reliable principles and methods, and that he applied those principles and methods to the facts and data.
what does the first line of 702 say?
Your Honor, it talks about the witness's qualification.
Why do we have expert testimony?
Because experts are more reliable than lay witnesses.
What's their goal? What's the goal of an expert witness?
To give technical, specialized knowledge.
To aid the jury in understanding testimony that they wouldn't otherwise understand?
Yes, Your Honor.
Why do you think the jury would not be able to understand what failing a field sobriety test means without the help of an expert?
Your Honor, because in the jury's mind, they probably have movies thinking about what happens in a field sobriety test. However, this is an officer who
Does that
actually
help you out?
conducts.
Don't those movies help you out? All those images of people stumbling around, don't those help you out a little bit?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Why is it that the jury needs to hear an expert to understand what failing a field sobriety test means?
Because, Your Honor, many people believe that if you cannot complete every task, then you have failed. But what this officer is telling us is that he's actually trained to look for specific mistakes that a lay person wouldn't necessarily notice.
Your response?
Unless Officer Foster goes into exactly what tests were conducted and how Mr. Dawson did on those tests, what meant that he failed them, we can't understand what Officer Foster means when he says that Mr. Dawson was intoxicated.
Your Honor,
I question whether or not he is an expert, but that's not really going to matter in the end. You can talk about all you want to, what the defendant did, how he may or may not have acted, what he failed. The ultimate conclusion, however, I'm going to leave to the jury because I do not believe the jury needs help in understanding what failing a field sobriety test means.
yes, Your
I
Honor.
think that's pretty common knowledge that is not needed, or we don't need expert testimony about. So I'm going to sustain her objection unless this individual has some sort of, did some sort of analysis of his blood or anything like that. I'm not going to let him testify about whether he believes the defendant was drunk.
Yes, Your Honor. To be clear, it's all right that he testifies that the defendant failed the test.
Oh, sure.
Yes, Your Honor.
Motion for that very last part of his testimony to be stricken.
Sure.
Officer Foster, what did you do when the defendant failed those field sobriety tests?
I sent him back to the police station to our lab expert to have his breath alcohol content determined.
Did that include your involvement with this accident?
No. At that point, I decided that it was appropriate to do a crime scene reconstruction.
What qualifies you to reconstruct crime scenes?
I hold a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. I'm a certified professional engineer, here in the state of Midlands, and I've worked for the fatal crash team in the Midlands Police Department for over 7 years now.
What kind of facts and data do you need and did you use when you reconstructed the crime scene?
Well, of course, I actually go to the crime scene itself, look at skid marks on the roadway, rutting in the grass, damage that was done to the obstacles. I also use the car itself, how the car was damaged, as well as statements from individuals involved.
What kind of principles and methods did you use to analyze those facts and data?
Well, I use the principles of physics, mechanical motion. All of the principles and methods that I use are laid out in the Windsor and Strasbourg article. It's the standard for vehicle accident reconstruction.
Were you able to do so reliably?
Yes.
After you reconstructed the crime scene, what was the first thing that you did?
Well, the first thing that I did, of course, was to make a diagram of the crime scene.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Please. But you don't need to ask me.
Yes, Your Honor. I'm showing opposing counsel prosecution's Exhibit 11. Officer Foster, is that the diagram that you made?
Yes, it is.
And is this a fair and accurate depiction of the crime scene?
It is.
Your Honor, I offer prosecution's 11 into evidence.
No objection.
This is, can we call it state 2?
Yes, Your Honor. Is it all right if we just ignore the stickers at the bottom then?
Well, if I had my, yeah, that's fine.
Your Honor, would you like
Normally,
a
I would
copy?
have somebody who could do that for you, but that's all right.
Your Honor, would you like a copy?
Please,
And is it all right if we show an enlarged copy of this?
any objection to that?
No, although I would ask to be able to move to view the demonstrative.
Yeah, you don't need to ask, just do it.
Officer Foster, you can step off the stand for a moment and come explain to us. All right, Officer Foster, what exactly happened the night of the accident?
Absolutely. The defendant was traveling northbound on Canyon Road when he approached a curve in the road to the left. What happened was he failed to negotiate the curve properly. That means that his right tires exited the roadway and he wasn't able to turn in time. We know this because we can see the right tires made rutting in the grass off the shoulder of the road to the right.
What happened after the driver went off the road?
After the driver went off the road, he proceeded for about 150 feet with about half the car off the side of the roadway. At that point, it seems apparent that he turned sharply to try to re-enter the roadway. Due to excessive speed for the weather conditions, caused what's called an overcorrection.
Excessive speed, how fast was the defendant traveling?
Before the defendant lost control, he was going about 66 miles an hour.
Objection, lack of foundation.
Your Honor, we've shown that this witness had sufficient facts and data, reliable principles and methods, and that he applied the principles and methods to the facts and data in this case. Under Rule 703, we don't have to disclose everything he used and how he did it in order to get to his conclusions.
Although they've established that they had sufficient facts and data, we should give the jury some understanding of how exactly he came to the conclusion that Danny Dawson was speeding that night by 66 miles an hour.
Yeah, I'm gonna sustain it until you can tell me how he got to that number. Just simply him saying, I have the facts and data, and therefore I can tell you everything about what happened that night. Yeah, it's not gonna work. I'm gonna need something more specific to tell me why he knows exactly how fast his car was going. If you can do that, then by all means have him testify to that, but I'm gonna
Yes,
see
Your Honor.
that.
Motion to strike that portion of the testimony?
Sure.
Officer Foster, you say he was going at excessive speeds. How did you determine that?
Well, what we can see is we can see how much damage was caused to the car when he actually struck the permanent objects. Based on how much damage was caused to the car, what kind of indentation was made, we can back calculate using specific physics formulas how fast he was going when he struck that object. It's because an object moving at a certain velocity has a certain energy. And if we know that, we can back calculate through friction how much energy he had to have had at the beginning of losing control.
And when you back calculated that, what were you able to determine the speed to be?
Before the defendant lost control and drove off of the roadway, he was going 66 miles an hour.
So he was going 66 miles an hour, he drove off the roadway, and then you were explaining what happened when he overcorrected.
Right. Because he was going so fast and the roads were wet at the time, he lost all traction between his tires and the road. Lost control of the vehicle, spun 90 degrees through his own lane of traffic, through the oncoming lane of traffic, where the front end of the vehicle struck a utility pole and then rotated into the tree. That's where the vehicle came to rest.
What happened when the vehicle rotated into a tree?
The tree struck the passenger side vehicle, and it was apparent that Vanessa was dead when I arrived.
Thank you, you can take your seat. Your Honor, I pass the witness.
Cross-examination? May I proceed? Good morning, Officer Foster.
Good morning.
I'd like to talk to you about the night of September 24th that you mentioned on direct examination.
Sure.
Now, that night you told us you were stationed off Canyon Road.
That's right.
you were stationed right off Canyon Road where it goes past and then curves, right?
That's right. It's a pretty long road. I was actually a couple miles before the curve in the road to the south.
And it was about 12 a.m. that morning that you were stationed there?
I was stationed there from about 11 at night to 7 in the morning. So yes, you're correct. That was about the time.
Now that night, it began to rain, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
In fact, it was a downpour.
It was.
You were having trouble watching the cars go by.
That's right.
Now at about 1 a.m., you saw a white Chevy Impala drive by.
Yes, I did.
It had the license plate Sully 3.
That's right.
So you knew that this was the Sullivan's car?
Yes, I did.
And you've since learned that Danny Dawson was the one driving it.
Yes.
Now that night, when that car went by, you saw that it was swerving.
Yes.
You saw that it was speeding.
Yes.
You thought it might be hydroplaning a little bit.
That's right.
But you didn't pull that car over, did you?
No, I didn't. I had another call come in at about that same time.
But you would agree with me, Officer Foster, that if you thought that Chevy Impala needed to be off the road, you would have taken care of that first.
Of course I would have.
Now later that night, you were called to Canyon Road where that collision occurred.
That's right, at about 1 a.m. or so.
And one of the first things you did when you got to the scene was conduct some field sobriety tests.
Yes, that's one of the things I did.
Now these are scientific tests, right?
I don't know if I call them scientific tests. We basically just use them to tell whether or not we need to send the individual on to have their blood alcohol content taken.
And these tests can tell you if someone may be intoxicated.
That's right.
So this test that all of Midlands Police relies on is to have Mr. Dawson recite his ABCs backwards.
And amongst various other tasks, yes.
Let's talk about some of those other tasks.
Sure.
One of them is to have someone stand on one foot and count to 1,000.
That's right.
And if someone can't do that, they might be intoxicated.
That's not exactly correct.
You wouldn't agree with me that if someone can't stand on their foot and count to 1,000, then that isn't a sign they may be intoxicated?
Well, what we're looking for is very specific mistakes that they make when trying to do that task. Just because they might have to put their foot down doesn't necessarily dispositively mean that they're intoxicated. We're looking for very specific mistakes that they make that we know that their mental judgments are impaired.
So if someone makes those very specific mistakes, they might be intoxicated.
That's exactly right.
Now, one of those other tests you used was having Mr. Dawson walk in a straight line.
Walk in a straight line while counting backward from 1,000, that's right.
And if someone can't do that, they have those specific mistakes, then they might be intoxicated.
Right. We're specifically looking for if they can't multitask. Everybody might stumble a little bit when trying to walk in a straight line, but what we're really looking for is that they can't do both things at the same time.
In fact, that night, you stumbled on the wet pavement, didn't you?
Yes, I almost slipped one.
That same wet pavement that you were having Danny Dawson take his test on.
No, I took him actually to the driveway of a nearby vehicle, the driveway of a nearby house. I think I stumbled on the road.
You would agree with me that both the driveway and the road were wet that night.
Definitely, yes.
Now I'd like to talk to you about some things that you didn't do at the crime scene. That night, as you already said, it was raining.
That's right.
And because of that, you couldn't take any notes.
No, I couldn't.
So everything you told us on direct examination is from memory alone.
I'd say that's true, yes.
Now that night when you first arrived at the scene, you didn't take any photos.
No, probably would have damaged the equipment.
The only photos you took were after the initial crash.
That's right.
And those photos helped you make your judgments in this case.
Yes, they helped me.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
No redirect, Your Honor.
Can this witness be found excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Any further from the state?
The prosecution would like to call Dr. Smith to the witness stand. yourself?
My name is Dr. Avery Smith.
Dr. Smith, what do you do?
I'm the director of the Midlands Department of Forensics. I'm also the chairman emeritus of the State of Midlands Board of Drug and Alcohol Influence. Basically what that means is during any criminal investigation, I'm in charge of any testing that needs to be done.
Why are you here today?
I administered a breathalyzer test to determine Mr. Dawson's blood alcohol content the night that he was brought in suspected of driving drunk.
How are you qualified to administer this test?
I have both a master's and a PhD in biostatistics from the University of Washington. I also have over 7 years of experience as a technician, operator, even instructor for the Intoxilyzer 8000, which is the machine that was used that night.
What kind of data and equipment did you use when you were conducting the breath alcohol concentration test?
It's honestly very simple. All you really need is the machine itself, the Intoxilyzer, 2 samples from the subject, and several control samples to run through the machine to make sure it's working properly.
Dr. Smith, how did you conduct this test?
I simply have the subject breathe into the machine. What the machine does is it takes this sample and holds it in a chamber and shoots a beam of infrared light through that chamber. Depending on how much of that light is either absorbed or reflected by the molecules in the chamber, it can tell the chemical content and tell how much alcohol is in it.
Is this Intoxilyzer 8000 and the procedure you used what other officers in the field use to determine blood alcohol concentration?
Yes, it's standard operating procedure, and the Intoxilyzer 8000 is used across the country.
And it is the same procedure you used when you examined the defendant?
Yes, it is.
Now, let's go back and recreate the night of the accident. Why was the defendant brought in that night?
It's my understanding that he was brought in because he had failed several standardized field sobriety tests, and the officer that arrested him thought that he might have been driving drunk.
What did you do once the defendant was brought in?
I sat him down and chatted with him and the officer for a few minutes while I finished calibrating and cleaning the machine I was about to use, and then I administered the test.
Before administering the test, did you prepare the defendant in any way?
I didn't personally know. I spoke with the officer to make sure that he'd been observed for at least 15 minutes before I administered the test, just to make sure that he wouldn't have any alcohol in his mouth that might contaminate the test results.
Why was this 15-minute period important?
Like I just mentioned, in the event that there is alcohol present in the subject's mouth from something like burping or drinking more or using mouthwash or vomiting, that could contaminate the test results because as air is expelled from the lungs, it can pick up some of that alcohol in the subject's mouth.
Now, before you conducted the test and as you talked to Mr. Dawson, what was your perception of the defendant?
To me, he seemed drunk. He was slurring his
Objection.
words.
Your Honor, Your Honor, the witness has not testified using any type of scientific test to make this conclusion. This is simply based off nothing.
Your Honor, according to Rule 701, when we're talking about the opinion testimony of the witness, if the witness is rationally able to determine whether or not what is being tested is true, and we accepted, the witness said she has 7 years of experience as a tester, we would assume that she does have the rational ability to determine whether or not he seemed drunk.
May I respond?
No, I'm sorry. If the officer can't do it, if I'm not gonna let the officer testify that he thought the defendant was drunk, I'm certainly not gonna let her say, well, I thought he was drunk, just by looking at him. So, yeah, the objection is sustained.
Move to strike, Your Honor.
Sure.
Dr. Smith, when you do this breath alcohol concentration test, you do make and keep some records.
Yes, I do. 3 in particular. I always have a checklist to make sure that I'm following standard operating procedure. I go through and check off what I have to do as I go along. I also have an operator's report where we record certain data about the subject himself, and then I get the printout from the machine which contains the results of the test.
Were you able to make these documents when testing the defendant?
Yes, I had all 3.
Your Honor, permission to approach the witness with prosecution exhibits 3, 4, and 5?
You don't need to ask my information. You don't need to ask my information.
And it doesn't counsel the document, the application? Show the witness, exhibits 3, 4, and 5. Dr. Smith, are these a true and correct copy of the documents you just listed out?
Yes, they are.
And when did you make these documents?
I made all of these documents as I was performing the tests.
Your Honor, the prosecution would like to offer the exhibits 3, 4, and 5 as evidence in this trial.
No objection, Your Honor.
We're going to call the states, go ahead, state 2, 3, 4, and 5, or how many? Or 3, 4, and 5?
3, 4, and 5.
Okay.
And may I publish them to the jury?
Please.
No, it's a
My conclusion was that his blood alcohol content was 0.19, which is 240% the legal limit here in Midlands.
Now, Dr. Smith, what does this percentage of 0.19 really mean when we're talking about a person who acts?
Well, to your average person, that might not seem like a lot, but the scale that we're talking about here ranges from about 0 to between 0.1 and 0.6, at which point somebody's either in the hospital or dead. So somebody at about 0.2, about 0.19, would be pretty drunk. They would be unable to make correct judgment calls. They'd be uncoordinated. Mr. Dawson that night in particular was slurring his words and stumbling as he entered the police station and spoke to me. Pretty much your standard drunk individual.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Absolutely.
Any cross?
Yes. May I proceed?
Please.
Good morning, Dr. Smith.
Good morning.
Earlier today, you said that you're the director for the Department of Forensics for Midlands.
That's correct.
As being the director for the Department of Forensics, you're very knowledgeable about the proper procedure for producing accurate results with these breathalyzer machines, correct?
Of course I am. As a matter of fact, I wrote the procedure that Midlands currently uses.
There are several steps when using these machines that you have to take to make sure you receive an accurate reading that isn't inflated by some other variable, correct?
Of course.
One of those steps is running a sample through the machine.
That's correct.
Another one of those steps is waiting 15 minutes for mouth alcohol to go away.
That's correct. And these are all things that I did in Mr. Dawson's case.
Waiting 15 minutes for mouth alcohol, mouth alcohol, the presence of mouth alcohol can produce a reading that makes it seem as if there's more alcohol in the person's body than really is.
That's correct, except for the fact that typically we can tell whenever that happens. The machine will look at the data and indicate a spike at the very beginning when the subject is initially breathing out. That's the mouth alcohol that's being picked up by the breath he's expelling. That spike will gradually decrease as he continues to breathe out, and the only alcohol present in the sample is from the subject's lungs.
Still, to make sure that does not happen, you typically wait 15 minutes before getting a test.
That's correct. That's standard operating procedure.
On the morning of September 25th, you gave Danny Dawson his breathalyzer test.
Yes, I did.
Danny Dawson walked into your lab at 1:40 a.m.
That's correct.
You gave him the test at 1:45 a.m.
That's correct. I spoke with the arresting officer who's trained to make observations for subjects who are about to be breathalyzed to make sure that he had been observed for the standard 15 minutes. What the officer told me was that he'd been in custody for over 20 and that the officer had been observing him the entire time.
Now, that officer was Ryan Foster.
That's correct.
he told you that happened, he told you he observed Danny Dawson while he was driving him back to the station.
Yes, he did.
Were you in the car at that time?
Of course not. I was back at the station making sure the machine was calibrated.
Thank you, no further questions.
Any redirect?
Yeah.
Any comments behind the excuse? Any more from the state?
No, Your Honor, the prosecution rests.
Do you want a break, Ajay?
Yes, Your Honor, we would like to request a recess if it's all right with you.
What time did we enter the room?
I am not sure. I'm sure it's posted in the hallway. We can go check all loss and see how we're doing.
10 minutes, okay?